Hello and welcome to Career Atoms. This video will really help improve your job interview preparation, which is of course vital to ensure strong performance on the day itself. Admittedly, the very thought of an interview can strike fear into the hearts of some, with visions of stern-faced panels throwing out unanticipated curveball questions. But whether it's an informal phone discussion with a recruiter, a 30-minute video call with the hiring manager, or a full-on face-to-face session, fortunately, most modern interviewing is a two-way, evaluative process that's simply designed to give you ample opportunity to prove yourself. And in an age of social media, companies are generally more focused on leaving you feeling positive about the experience, regardless of the outcome. Over the years, I've interviewed thousands of candidates for a huge variety of roles, and there's a very visible gulf between those who clearly researched and prepared well compared to those who didn't. By just getting to the interview stage, you're already ahead of potentially hundreds of other applicants, so make the most of every opportunity and maximise your chances of success. The guidance provided in this video will aid your preparation, boost confidence, and hopefully ensure you give a very strong account of yourself in every interview situation. It's often stated that you join a company rather than a job, and as such, you'll want to ascertain if the company matches your expectations and prioritise a wish list of must-have and desirable elements. Thorough research will also enable you to come up with key questions you'll want to ask at interview, plus the additional insight gained will allow you to throw in the occasional comment that will help position you as someone who's prepared, knowledgeable and interested. The obvious starting points are the company's website, especially any career pages, which can often provide lots of very useful information that will help you prepare. Plus, you'll get a temperature gauge on the current business situation by assessing the volumes and kind of roles being recruited. If it's a larger company and they're available online, check out recent financial accounts, not just for the figures, but because you often also get a perspective on the business strategy, the wider market climate, opportunities and challenges. Lots of companies are obviously now very active on various social media channels, so these could also be useful. Conduct quick internet searches for any relevant news items and reach out to anyone in your network that may provide additional insight. There's also company review websites like Glassdoor, where you can view employee feedback, CEO ratings, and sometimes even get additional insight into the interview process and typical questions asked. The only caveat I'd flag about Glassdoor is the old adage that people are often more inclined to post comments about negative experiences than positive ones, so keep a somewhat open mind when you read negative reviews. Even the very best companies won't always be the best fit for every single person. Assuming the company checks out well, you'll also want to make sure you have all the relevant logistical and procedural information beforehand. What does the interview process entail? Is this the final deciding stage or just the beginning? Is there anything they want you to bring with you or even prepare beforehand? Ask questions. Companies and recruiters are usually very happy to provide ample information, and some may even give you very useful additional snippets. Also, who's interviewing you? What are their roles, and are they ultimately the decision makers? Glance over their LinkedIn profiles to help build more of a picture, and you might also discover a mutual connection, a common interest, or something else that may help when it comes to interview small talk and rapport building. It's difficult to sell yourself at interview and persuade others you should be hired if you're not already fully aware of your achievements, the value you can bring, and your alignment to the role requirements as laid out in the job description. If you haven't already done so, review my brief self-evaluation video on the website. Also, go back through your CV over and over, particularly your achievements, until you're confident you can talk through every single element without any hesitation or fumbling. Commit any pertinent facts and figures to memory and make sure they're precise. Remember from the CV writing video, talking about a £5.3 million project rather than 5 million makes it even more believable and conveys an impression that you're on top of the detail. Go through the job description and map out how your experience aligns to the requirements, and where there are some gaps, what you could potentially say to help bridge them. Identify why you're interested in the role and company, what value you feel you can bring, and if you already have some good level of insight into the position and why the company's hiring, how you could potentially make life easier and better for the hiring manager. Jot these points down and go over them again and again. Look through some of the more typical interview questions we've included in the FAQ section on the Career Atoms website and consider how you would best answer them. Mentally rehearse your responses. Everything to this point has hopefully been fairly straightforward, common sense stuff that you'd expect most candidates would do as a matter of course. And admittedly, for many jobs, this type of prep will be more than enough. But in an increasingly competitive environment, I think it's prudent to further stack the dice in your favour. So I'm going to finish today by going through a more advanced preparation technique, which could pay dividends and put you ahead of the field. common style of interviewing involves assessing your alignment against a few core behaviours or competences that are seen as being critical to success in the role. Some of these behaviours will be role dependent, but could include things like planning and organising, communication and influencing skills, problem solving, team working, leadership, decision making, customer focus, driving for improvements and creativity, etc. There are plenty of others, but you hopefully get the idea. In an interview, rather than simply being asked if you have the behaviours deemed important, you'll either be quizzed on a relevant situation you've highlighted on the CV, or more likely, given free rein to relate an example of your own choosing. Questions usually begin with, "Tell me about a time when," or "Give me a specific example where you've." As such, a key part of your preparation can involve reflecting over your career and picking out the most suitable examples of relevant behaviours. But how do you know which ones to focus your prep on? It's common to see some highlighted in the role description, or at least indirectly hinted at, so go through this first of all and note them down. Also think broadly about your line of work and identify any other behaviours that are especially relevant. Most should be fairly self-evident. For example, if you're a project manager, you're likely to be quizzed about planning and organisational skills and communication, amongst others. A managerial role interview may naturally attract questions about leadership, decision-making and influencing. And in customer services, you should expect questions about customer focus and communication. For example, handling difficult customer situations or going the extra mile to deliver great service, etc. A behavioural focused interview would likely cover off just a few of the primary relevant areas, so you don't want to go over the top completely in your prep and end up with a list of 15 or 20 behaviours. Focus on the most relevant ones, and you'll probably shortlist a minimum of 3 to 4, but most likely around 5 to 7. Against each of the key behaviours you've listed, you'll need to think about 3 things. First, your overall ideology on the topic. Second, the most appropriate work examples. And lastly, the critical things you did in that situation that made all the difference. By ideology, I mean your guiding principles, your tried and tested approach and your sense of what great looks like. Write down some keywords, phrases and principles that come to mind against each behaviour. For example, a manager's ideology on leadership could be all about establishing a solid plan, setting a vision, getting the team bought into this, and then supporting them on a journey from point A to B. Or a customer service rep's ideology when it comes to dealing with difficult customers might include always using a calm tone, listening carefully, providing reassurance and following up. Everything you jot down here will then help when it comes to the second area of consideration. Against each behaviour, pick out the best work examples or stories where you've actually put a particular aspect of your ideology, or even all of it, into practice. As you reflect on this, hopefully a few suitable situations come to mind. Carefully evaluate each one to identify what you believe is the strongest or most compelling story, the priority one that most aptly demonstrates the behaviour, the story that interviewers definitely need to hear about. If you've also noted a good second example, keep it as a backup, just on the off chance you're ever asked to relate more than one example. It's critical to prioritise the right stories, as you don't want to be kicking yourself after an interview when you later recall something that's much stronger and far more compelling. So when it comes to choosing and prioritising examples, here's a few things to keep in mind. Interviewers like to hear about times you've successfully overcome difficult challenges. So if you're an IT engineer and you're considering examples of problem solving, don't pick the time when you fixed a PC by simply switching it off and on again. Highlight when an issue wasn't immediately obvious and you evidenced tenacity, analytical thinking, a systematic approach to get to the root cause, and perhaps some wider research. Similarly, if you're a salesperson considering times you've influenced a customer, don't focus on the one that was easy. Pick the time when you faced huge skepticism and worked really hard to identify the right approach to bring the customer around to your way of thinking. In my experience, the better stories are often the ones where you've succeeded in more difficult situations, times where your mettle has really been tested. Keep in mind that interviewers like to hear stories that are frankly just interesting. Perhaps it's a time when you faced some peril and made a calculated risk, or you undertook a new creative approach. A time where you achieved something significant against all odds, or even learnt a valuable lesson. Which of your stories will likely capture their attention? Are there any that they'll be able to relate to and empathise with in some way? The more confidently you can relate the story, the better. Use exact facts and figures rather than approximations, as subconsciously this will reinforce the believability factor in the interviewer's mind. Conversely, if you sound hazy or woolly because you haven't really thought it through in advance, or you just can't go into the detail when probed further, you'll introduce some doubts. If you can, put greater weight behind more recent situations rather than only focusing on stuff that happened a long time ago. Otherwise, the interviewer may naturally question if it was purely an historical, never to be repeated one-off, and whether you've since demonstrated what they're looking for. If your story also highlights additional secondary behaviours, then even better. Perhaps in addition to describing the problem-solving steps, the IT engineer also throws in how they reassured and regularly updated an agitated user, thus additionally evidencing communication and customer focus skills. Or they finish their story by mentioning how they then documented the issue and put it on a shared drive which colleagues could access, thus also evidencing improvement, focus and teamwork. By picking the example and thinking broadly, you might also evidence additional important behaviours, all of which reinforce a very positive perception in the interviewer's mind. If possible, try to end up with a mix of examples that cover more than just one brief work period or isolated situation. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't have, for example, 2 or even potentially 3 strong examples of different behaviours that emanate from a single absolute standout situation, but it might get a little repetitive and one-dimensional for an interviewer if you use the exact same story every single time you're asked a question. If your work experience supports it, you ideally want to give the impression you've demonstrated key things across multiple roles and situations, which helps to reinforce the impression of more consistent, positive behaviours. It's just part of your DNA. It's how you effectively tackle situations, and it's how you're likely to make a positive impact in a new role. Once you're clear about the top 1 or 2 examples for each behaviour, consider the very specific key things you did and said in the situations that ultimately made all the difference, and without which the outcome or result absolutely wouldn't have been the same. This third element is crucial for 2 reasons. First, as you honestly evaluate in this manner, you might actually determine that sometimes your role and input wasn't quite as pivotal as you'd initially imagined. Perhaps it was really your colleague or manager that played a far greater role, and you were a more passive observer. Or maybe a positive result was just down to good fortune, etc. Either way, if you're struggling to identify your specific role and direct input, it's probably not the right example to share, so move on and pick another. Second, if the example stands up to scrutiny, your insight into the specific ways you made a difference is absolutely critical, because it's exactly these things that you'll want to emphasise and really hammer home when you relate it in the interview. We'll talk about this more in the second part video. If you've been thorough in your preparation, you might end up with something that looks a bit like this. I've just highlighted 3 key behaviours for illustration purposes, but your list may have more. Against each one, there's some very brief keywords regarding the underlying ideology, which then helps you identify the most appropriate examples you want to share. And then the key things reinforce and demonstrate your precise role in actively bringing about the positive result. I've added a column in for a second backup example just in case, and then the prompts column is just that, a few facts and figures to recall. I've kept the whole thing pretty concise, but you might prefer slightly more detailed notes. Anyway, once completed, go over it again and again in your preparation, practicing and rehearsing stuff to yourself until it's second nature, and you can confidently relate an example and the salient key points. I'd also either print out a copy or scribble some similar things in a notebook and take it along to the interview with me, along with some written key questions I want to ask, a copy of my CV and the job description. If at any point I had a bit of a mind blank, I'd just simply glance down at this page. It takes a bit of time and effort to put together a crib sheet like this, but once it's completed, you can more easily update it from time to time and use it again at any future point. Now, I appreciate we've gone into quite a bit of detail on this, but it's a really useful preparation exercise because it forces you to forensically contemplate your experience, be very clear about your achievements and specific contribution. Realistically, there's hardly any interview process that would be quite so thorough as to possibly cover everything that you've prepared on, so invariably there'll be a lot of stuff that you don't end up talking about, but that's fine. It's much better that you over-prepare and go into the interview feeling a lot more confident. And even if these particular types of behavioural questions don't come up at all, and instead, perhaps you're asked to just talk more generally about your approach, you can do so, but then also add in at the end that you have a really good corresponding real-life situation if they'd like to hear about it. This now concludes the interview preparation video. In the second part, we'll go into detail on the actual occasion itself, especially looking at how you can best structure and concisely relate the stories you share. Thank you very much for watching.